atWork Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and pay our respect to elders past and present. This podcast is being recorded in the southwest and Western Australia, which is land of the Noongar people. We'd also like to pay our respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from wherever you may be listening from. Welcome everyone to another episode of Candid Conversations with Shaun. In this episode, I'm joined by Galit Bailey. Galit is a registered psychologist and atWork Australia's wellness advisor. I've been fortunate enough to have many conversations with Galit over the years discussing how employment can be beneficial for people who experience mental health concerns. In this episode, Galit talks us through some of the additional challenges that people with mental health concerns face at each stage throughout the employment journey. Like always, I always learn so much from talking to Galit, and I'm sure you will too. Thanks so much, Galit, for agreeing to come on today and be a guest on our podcast and I guess speak to us about your career journey and your experience in supporting people to be able to overcome their mental health concerns to be able to find meaningful employment.
Hi, Shaun. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries at all. And I guess just to get things started, can we learn a bit more about, I guess, your career journey and your professional career so far?
Sure. So where do I start? So I'd better start by saying that I actually went to university a bit later. I'm one of these people that have a strong belief in acquiring life experiences, traveling, and particularly just developing. I was very keen on developing a bit of a more broad cross-cultural orientation. I had a strong desire to sort of really understand how other people live. So I traveled for quite a while before embarking on studies at university. And I was actually doing human resources work whilst I was completing my university education in the area of psychology. And I was doing it in Africa whilst living in Africa. So that was a great exposure to a sort of a HR psychology, maybe sort of related work within a multicultural context, which was great. When I finished my degree, I moved straight into high-end commercial recruitment, which was a massive transition. That was in the UK. Absolutely fascinating industry. I learned a lot. After a period of time, I started having that niggling need to actually provide support to those who are maybe more disadvantaged and genuinely need the help. I kept kind of having the sense that people that I was working with can pretty much manage on their own. We've had, for example, in the recruitment environment, a barrier could be someone's accent. So if they had a regional accent, that could have, for example, prevented them or enabled entry into certain organizations or certain industries. And it just seemed so random at times that this would be a real factor. So I had this desire to actually move to working with people that are needing a lot more support. And I was thrilled to have been offered a job in what was a pilot employment support program. That was back in the UK. And I worked in providing coaching and some counseling support as well to highly disadvantaged job seekers, which I absolutely loved. I later moved into managing employment projects, and I fell in love with employment services. For me, it had the perfect combination of challenge and reward. I found that it always sort of kept me on my toes. I was then really happy to learn that employment services is a thriving privatized sector in Australia. It was way after the privatization of employment services. And I was very fortunate to be invited to join an assessment team that on behalf of Department of Human Services provided job capacity assessments, employment support assessments, and other on-the-job support assessments and so forth. There was also an opportunity there for me to actually complete a psychology internship within the industry that I'm very passionate about and become a fully registered psychologist. So I've been able to actually become a psychologist within the sector of employment services. I later joined atWork Australia and worked as a resident psychologist in a couple of the Perth North sites, providing assessments and evaluations, some diagnostic assessments and brief intervention services for our clients. And for the past 9 years, I've actually been working as a principal advisor where I'm supporting and coaching 46 health practitioners that work alongside job coaches to offer non-vocational psychotherapeutic support, if you like. So I'm very privileged to work with, as I said, 46 health practitioners, mostly psychologists. Last year, we've also embraced counselors and social workers into our team. Yeah, and that's what I've been doing for the last 9 years. And no 2 days are the same. It's all every day is a new day. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, yeah, like you say, a nutshell. And I guess I don't know where to start with that. I think we could create a podcast just speaking about your journeys traveling and working abroad. It sounds like it must have been an incredible time of your life.
That was absolutely incredible. I don't know if I want to burden the world with listening to it, but it was absolutely incredible. And I think that extra perspective of really knowing that things in different languages have a different meaning and, having that broader cultural perspective, I think it really helps, career-wise in terms of our work, and particularly the work that we do, everything that we do in a cultural context. It's always in a cultural or a cross-cultural context. So that experience was really valuable. I certainly would recommend that to anyone, not to rush into further education, have a bit of a life skill, go and experience and see how other people live. So yeah, I certainly recommend that to anyone.
And I guess you've worked in employment services in multiple countries. I guess the barriers, what people are facing overseas, similar to what we see our clients facing?
It very much depends. So, as I was saying, I actually started working in this industry in the UK, and one thing that I've learned in this industry, working sort of very closely day in, day out, and throughout my time working in employment services in the UK, it actually became very clear to me that attitude and motivation are really the biggest barriers. And in fact, I'm prepared to argue and challenge and say that these are the only actual barriers that exist for people. And people come in and they talk about health concerns and mental health concerns and a lot of distressing personal circumstances, financial homelessness, relationships. The mitigating or the mediating factor or factors are attitude towards employment and motivation. And when you don't have that is the biggest barrier to employment. Even any other, very simple barrier would be very, very hard to overcome. And yet, if you do have motivation and a favorable attitude towards employment, any barrier, even the most considerable barriers and mental health barriers that we've seen, are surmountable. They're manageable. They can be addressed because the person is determined to go into work. So in that sense, what I've seen, around the world is universal. So that's really the most important thing. Outside of that, there is a cultural context. There are cultures that are more informed by what we would maybe call a class system, people that have seen their parents working or not working and how much that, dictates their future. The economic environment is really important. Living in Africa, people are desperate to work. They will spend, days sleeping in a location where there's a potential employment opportunity or vocational training opportunity. But the problem is in many African economies that the employment is not there. So that really changes the market. So there are a lot of culture-specific or country-specific circumstances, but psychologically, the attitude and the motivation are a common factor in terms of the likelihood of employment or the relationship with employment that every individual has.
Yeah, I guess we're fortunate in Australia. If you have the right attitude, then there is the supports out there who can help you to progress and get to wherever you want to go, I guess. But like you say, it's all about the attitude and the personal motivation to have that want to do that.
Exactly. Very much so.
And I guess this might be a challenging question for you, but why psychology? What drove you to study psychology and then, I guess, more specifically to work in employment services?
Yes, so I was always sort of interested in human behavior. I even took a uni course as a high school student, because I was always interested, back in the time it was, maybe a bit less about positive psychology and strengths. It was maybe a bit more about Freud and all of the subconscious, but I still found it all very interesting. And it was, pretty much a given that I would choose to further my studies in this area. In terms of career, really employment services was was, in fact, my first love, as I was saying. So I actually, went into that before I even considered completing my psychology internship post-degree and becoming a registered psychologist. And like I was saying before, looking at the commonality, looking at the most common issue or barrier or challenge that people are facing, and whatever it is they are facing, it's always mediated by, the attitude and the motivation that a person has in the sense of, going into employment, looking for work, staying in work, the idea of employment in general. And that was, for me, the interface between, employment services and psychology. It was kind of becoming very clear that when I work with people on their attitude and on building and eliciting that motivation, so working with them on the sort of psychological space is actually helping them to move into sustainable employment. So it was just like a meeting place of my two passions, if you like.
Yeah. And I guess supporting people into employment, well, I guess employment makes the foundation for a person's life. We all probably complain about having to go to work at that point, but without having a job, it doesn't allow us to, I guess, live our lives on our own terms. So I guess supporting people to be able to get that freedom to live the life they want, the way they want, must give you a lot of pride in being able to support people to achieve that.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is. Yes, we have a moan. Yes, it'd be nice if we, sometimes would have a choice of not quite going to work every day of the sort of 5 days of the week and so forth. And sometimes we don't feel like it. We wake up on the wrong side. But overall, the notion of employment adds to a meaningful life for starters. We don't just want to live and exist. We want to have meaning to our lives. And that's the perfect way to actually work towards that, even if we're not quite there at the moment. We have the potential to work towards meaning in our life through employment. It's just a perfect opportunity. And it does give us a sense of control and a sense of freedom, because we can procure with the money that we receive from work. We can procure whatever it is not whatever it is, our wants are endless, and, obviously resources are always limited for everyone. But
yes, it is.
We have the freedom of choice, which, let's face it, we don't have if we're unemployed. Even if we receive payments from the government, these are generally quite limited. So that unemployment takes away that freedom of choice, or a lot of it, really. So yeah, definitely agree with you on that. That sense of pride when you help somebody move towards employment is enormous. I don't know how to get it in other places.
Yeah. And I know we've had many conversations around mental health and employment over the years, and the topic is far too big to be able to tackle in one podcast episode. But why is it more difficult for people who experience mental health concerns to be able to secure employment?
Yeah, it is a massive topic, and there's probably quite a few doctoral theses and a lot of research that went into this question, worldwide. And we know quite a few things. We know quite a few general sort of facts from all the research that's been done, and we know that mental health was shown to be a consequence, but also a risk factor for unemployment. So, in other words, people who are faced with unemployment, so they've maybe been employed and now they're unemployed, will develop some sort of a mental health concern. The longer they remain out of employment, the more perhaps rigorous and profound mental health concerns are likely or are at a risk of becoming. And the flip side, the other side of it, is somebody with a mental health condition or mental health concerns is much more likely to experience unemployment. So we know that people with mental illness and even substance use issues have lower employment rates in the population. That's just literally a general rule of thumb. And we know that severe mental health complaints are generally associated with high rates of unemployment. And that's, again, in different environments, in different economies, different populations. We also know that mental health issues are associated with low job retention, higher level of absenteeism. And it's generally a big problem, for people with mental illness. The whole sort of aspect of employment is a much bigger challenge to tackle for people who suffer mental health concerns. We also know, I think it was 2022, that was the recent research in Australia. We know that only 26%, roughly 26, maybe up to 30% of people with psychosocial disabilities, so what we're calling psychological mental health problems, only that amount of people, that percentage, are employed. And that's in comparison to about 57 to 60% of people with other disabilities. So one that has a mental health concerns is twice or more likely to be unemployed than a person with any other disability. So that's quite serious.
Well,
So
that's quite staggering, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really staggering and very sobering statistic when you start looking at the statistics. We actually, we have an obligation of really breaking it down and trying to understand where it's coming from. So when we are trying to ask what is it in the mental health space that is, maybe leading to these challenges or difficulties, and there's quite a few things. One aspect is the actual difficulty, or what we would maybe call the symptoms that a person is facing, the nature of the symptoms, the mental health difficulties, and the side effect of treatment. Sometimes the treatment, particularly medication treatment for mental health complaints, have got some side effects that they themselves actually present a barrier. So if we take, for example, depression, many times it presents with low mood, with disturbance to sleep, and then tiredness and concentration difficulties. A person that experiences these symptoms will struggle to actually meet many of your typical employment demands. So, work for long hours when you're very tired and you can't concentrate, even sometimes being able to travel to work safely, in your own car or accessing public transport, focusing and learning work tasks and practice your work safely and staying alert. So all of these things could be affected by, as an example, by the symptoms of depression. We know, for example, with schizophrenia or any other psychotic illness, those illnesses that have a long duration and a profound impact, these actually impact our cognition, so our thinking and our learning, our attention. That means that a person is likely to struggle to learn new work tasks. They may feel that they would be much slower, and they may actually be slower in comparison to somebody who doesn't experience these symptoms. And experiencing poor concentration. So again, there's the whole function with, just typical, very general aspects of work in comparison to a person that doesn't suffer these difficulties and symptoms.
And if an employer is unaware that a person's experiencing these challenges, they can make assumptions about the individual's abilities, about their commitment to the job, or say that they're lazy, but really they're battling these conditions alone.
Exactly. And that's another aspect that I was kind of thinking about when I'm thinking about the connection, not necessarily to do with the individual. It's to do with stigma. It's to do with education or lack thereof from the employer's perspective, maybe previous experience that have shaped realistic or unrealistic expectations or misexpectations, if you like. So that's certainly another aspect. And that is also something that's impacting the individual, because the individual is already experiencing difficulties and they're worried about their work performance. And one of the things that somebody with a mental health complaint would think about, would certainly go through their head, is how am I going to be perceived? Is anyone noticing, that I'm different because I experience a mental health condition or complaint? Am I going to be slower? Am I going to have to ask for a lot of explanations, for example, repetition? What is that going to look like? Am I going to jeopardize my employment because I might need a little bit more or much more support? And that's certainly a source of disheartenment and stress for people that, desperately want to work, but are very concerned about how their mental health concerns and symptoms are going to affect them. Another concern that people would have, and it's a valid concern, is reliability. People generally want to be reliable at work, and employers need reliable employees. And with mental health concerns that maybe tend to be episodic, there's some conditions where there's episodes of higher capacity and lower capacity, episodes where somebody actually needs some treatment and they cannot be in work, sometimes people could experience exacerbation or worsening of their existing condition. Which makes everyone a bit more concerned about how am I going to be? Am I going to be reliable? Am I going to show up to work every day? And so forth. So there's loads of factors that are actually impacting a person.
And I guess it can create that spiraling effect as well, because you speak about how a person starts to question their own abilities. They might not apply for a job, they might not be successful, and then that just again exacerbates their condition and I guess continues to make them spiral into a deeper and darker depression potentially.
Exactly. And that's very true. And that's what we call, or, I'd like to call the mediating factors. So there's the impact of what the mental health condition or complaint does and its actual symptoms, and maybe the side effects of medication, stuff like that. But there's also the view or the opinion that one has on themselves and their relationships with others and their ability to be productive and to meet expectations. And that creates other what we call mediating barriers or factors, which is the impact on self-esteem, which then impacts on the person's motivation. There's what we call, and I think that's what you're alluding to, Shaun, learned helplessness. I'm going to try, but, I'm going to really struggle. It's going to produce a great sense of anxiety. The last time I tried, my anxiety has gone through the roof, or I became more depressed. So should I try? I don't know if I should try.
Yeah.
So that makes things worse, like you said.
And I guess, it's very rare that you apply for a job and you get it. Often you have to apply for multiple jobs and you might start securing an interview. You might get a number of interviews before you actually secure a position. But that whole process of receiving negative feedback, not securing a position, for a person to experience these challenges, they might see it as, they've just been vulnerable, put themselves in this challenging situation just to get knocked back. What impact does it then have on them?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the thing, because setbacks are a normal part of looking for a job, where as we say to our clients, you kind of you want to work at it. You have to work at it. Yeah, looking for a job is a job. And setbacks and rejections, they're part of it. We've got a lot of different ratios on, applications for interviews for jobs. But when you look at the world of employment through the lens of mental health difficulties and stigma, the impact of every one of those rejection is much more detrimental to a person who is experiencing mental health concerns. And this is why they need a lot of support along the way and a lot of nurturing and just a realistic perspective, I suppose, on, this is pretty normal, just get up and let's start walking again, sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we can break down the employment journey perhaps into 3 different stages and maybe discuss some of the different challenges that people might face along each stage of that journey. We can first look at pre-employment. What are some of the additional challenges that people living with mental health concerns might face at this stage of the employment journey? I guess the first stage of finding a job is searching for a job, identifying suitable jobs to apply for. What might be some of the additional challenges throughout this stage of the journey? Would it be having that self-confidence to think you're capable of being able to apply for that position and perform that role, and I guess having the courage to apply? What do you think some of the barriers might be there for a person who experiences mental health concerns?
Yeah, so there's a lot of the issues that would be experienced, again, to do maybe with the specific difficulties or the specific symptoms that are perhaps associated with that particular mental health complaint. So, for example, a person that is struggling with concentration, with fatigue, maybe with drowsiness due to medication side effect. First of all, that would limit one's employment options. There's some employment opportunities that would not be safe and not be realistic for this person. So you're talking about, first of all, you're talking about narrowing of employment options. With that, we need to consider that some, employment aspirations may not be realistic. So if one has worked, for example, in operating machinery, they were then later diagnosed with a mental health condition, it's not safe for them to work in machinery. They're still determined to go back to a similar environment. That's not necessarily a realistic option. And the person is faced now with a major challenge of reinventing themselves, basically, which can be, again, really disheartening. And it would lead to that sort of learned helplessness of it's all too hard, basically. We can also talk about some cognitive or thinking and learning barriers. So if that's something that I experience as part of my mental health concern, I would really struggle to understand the written labor market, job descriptions, even career descriptions, completing applications, putting through a really good resume. It's quite likely that I would struggle to do that independently. And moreover, if I'm thinking that I'm struggling, I'm probably going to be worried about how I'm going to do with learning and remembering work tasks when I finally get a job. So that could put me off altogether right from the word go. Another really important thing is the whole interpersonal interaction stuff, which is one of the things that, we want to mention in the context of mental health and employability. This is a massive thing for people with mental health concerns. Most mental health concerns actually express with some sort of a disruption to interpersonal interaction. It could be social withdrawal. Sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes it's a profound difficulty to relate and converse to people on on an expected level, on an expected sort of space. So people with mental health concerns ultimately feel the challenge of any sort of interpersonal connection, which means that there would be a very considerable challenge with the socially appropriate job-seeking behaviors, So how do we reach out, maybe cold call or present to an employer, network with people and come in contact with them, whether it's, online, by phone, face-to-face. Yeah. There could be quite a bit of a struggle with that. And worse than that, when the person is aware and worried about their interpersonal skills, they may avoid job searching altogether. Another impact is mood. A lot of mental health conditions have some impact on mood, and mood impacts motivation. So a lot of people would struggle to lift themselves up and to say, I need to do this. I really want to do this. I need to get myself up, get ready and start, kind of doing some work towards it. So quite a lot of difficulties, at that point.
And I guess the whole journey, it does require a lot of vulnerability, because most of the time you have one opportunity to be able to showcase the best version of yourself, to show that why you're the better person for this job. And I guess that leads into the next stage, was if a person does secure an interview, what are some of the additional challenges that they might face at this point? Because like I just said, that you sort of have to go into this whole situation of where the lights, the cameras are all faced on you. You're getting asked the questions and you get one chance to be able to prove yourself, I guess.
Exactly. And this is a whole new world of challenge, because we've got all of the other challenges that we spoke about. Am I even going to apply? Am I motivated? What's going to happen? How am I going to interact with people? How am I going to learn the job? So all of these plus. And the plus is the whole overwhelm of the prospect of interacting with unfamiliar people, but not only just interacting with them, but engaging in the self-promotion activities. I'm basically standing there and I'm not just selling any other product, I'm actually selling myself. I'm promoting myself. I have to sing my own praises, which a person with a mental health concern is struggling with at any day, given the mediating barrier of issues with lack of confidence and self-esteem. So there's a whole other layer of complexity and anxiety that comes up with an interview, any sort of interview situation. And we need to add to this also the actual employer interface. So we will tend to ask ourselves, is this employer mental health informed? Does this particular workplace have some policies and, any sort of mental health awareness, a value statement, maybe training or experience? We know a lot that we know from a lot of research that employers that are experienced with hiring people with mental health concerns are going to be much more open and likely to continue and hire people with mental health concerns. So there's much less of a stigma. But you don't always know that. You don't always know that when you apply for a job, and you will be concerned about a stigma. And another aspect is self-disclosure. So a question could come up around whether I do need to disclose. Maybe in some circumstances, it's a good idea to disclose my condition, because I might need to go, for treatment. I might need to take time off. I might have an episodic mental health complaint. So this is also a concern for people who are about to go on an interview. Do I self-disclose? What is the best way to disclose?
Yeah, and I guess like, an interview can be like a social dance. You say like it's a sales
Mm,
pitch, but you're not selling a product, you're selling yourself. And
mm.
the only way to get better at that is by doing interviews, being successful in securing interviews. But just to mention that statistic you mentioned earlier, that if people don't have that experience or never make it to that stage, then I guess they don't develop the skills to then be able to progress even part to the next phase of the journey.
Exactly. And that is the catch 22. It's almost like you need experience to do well in that. But if you don't get the experience, how the hell do you do well in that sort of thing? So
Yeah.
it is a catch 22. But obviously, being aware of all of these issues and all of these pieces of insight is going to help us determine how to support a person in this space.
And then once a person, they are successful in the interview, they make it past and into the next stage. What challenges do they then face when they, it come time for their first day and it actually becomes time to start the job?
Yeah, that's a really brilliant sort of focus, and it's a very important focus because whilst it's a very joyous occasion and definitely a reason to celebrate. This is what we're working towards. We know the benefits of employment, but starting work is also intimidating. The starting work anxiety is pretty normal. We all have that. There's a level of anxiety that we experience, and we know that a little bit of anxiety is very good for us because it drives us into productive action. For people with mental health concerns, this anxiety could be sort of more intense and probably more of an intimidating prospect for a person with mental health concerns. And the main factor here is the self-doubt. So the main factor here, the sort of mediating factor, is the sense of inadequacy and self-doubt, which we've spoken about already. And we know that that's inherent with a person who has a mental health concern and has been looking for a word for some time and had to really work hard to challenge themselves and get to that stage. The self-doubt and the sense of inadequacy and the fear of facing prejudice and stigma and how would I do in comparison to other people, that is enormous. That's quite intense for people with mental health concern. And that's something we need to take into consideration. There's also concerns about a relapse or an exacerbation, so I could have a mental health concern that is stabilized, that it's well managed, but introducing work into, my daily routine, which is, takes quite a considerable amount of time from one's day, could actually lead to increased stress and to worsening of the symptoms or the mental health concerns. And on top of that, again, like we said, it might be an episodic condition. I might have highs and lows, manic episodes, depressive episodes, and I'm now concerned about how I would ride those episodic fluctuations or relapse or exacerbation when I'm in employment without being unreliable, without being absent too much. So I'm already concerned about that before I started working. And the straightforward symptoms concerns, again, the concentration, the cognitive impact on, learning and memory, sleep, that's always somewhat affected with many mental health conditions. One would worry about how they would be able to meet the ordinary day-to-day work-related challenges, planning how to get to work, managing work and life demands, all of that, forever juggling act, which is, challenging as it is. Difficulties in learning and remembering the work tasks. So all of these are, fears that are quite real for people. And beyond all of this, there's also the fear around and the concern around financial affairs. So I finally got a job. What does it mean to my finances? Might I lose, some of my subsidies or benefits? For example, housing subsidies, state-paid housing subsidies could be affected. Am I going to have sufficient tax credits? How can I fund childcare? All of these are great concerns for a person that's, maybe just about managing all of these life demands on low income. Introducing employment can add another level of complexity to that. So again, quite a few things to be aware of.
Yes, it sounds like it's a very incredibly challenging process. And I know you just speak about the sleep prevention, when someone's already fatigued, I think about myself, when you've had a few sleepless nights, it becomes harder to get up in the morning, you're less motivated, but then add the mental health challenges on top of that, it's just a compounding and forever getting more challenging.
Exactly.
And
It is a compounding effect, and that's the risk. That's a danger.
And how can we best support people through these different stages of the journey? I understand in the early stages, when we're looking for work, the support might come from a family member or a friend or the atWork Australia job coach. And I guess as they progress into the interview and into employment, the support then has to come from the employer as well and their friends as well, I guess.
I think this is the most important conversation that we need to have around people that are struggling with mental health, whatever the complaint might be, and particularly as people who are employment specialists. We work with our clients and our job seekers, and with employers, we provide that interface. And we focused quite a bit in our discussion now on analyzing and looking at the barriers, which is, maybe not the most optimistic conversation, but we must remember, the most important thing to really remember is that employment is highly instrumental in improving mental health. So just like unemployment negatively impacts mental health, employment is actually an important factor that improves mental health. And even when the most severe mental health concerns are considered, so the important thing to remember is that we must really pull all the stops and put our heads together and provide the best possible support for people, because we know that this will be better for them. The other important fact that we need to remember, and that's again from research, is that the vast majority of people with mental health concerns want to work. So if we go back to the most important, barriers and protective factors, the positive attitude is already there. And, in my experience, this is the biggest protective factor. So this will help people going to work. Now, how do we do all of that without necessarily being a mental health worker, educated in mental health concerns? There's a couple of really important steps. The first step, and maybe that's a good step for us, people will support people into work, in the job coach or the employment consultancy space. The first step is to do a very good assessment in terms of supporting this person. And when we say assessment, we don't mean a mental health assessment or a psychological assessment. We want to do an assessment of the problem. So we're not interested in the name or the label of that mental health condition. We want to ask our client, what does it look like for you? What does the problem look like in your day-to-day life, in your function? And what does it mean for employment? So this is the way in which we work at atWork Australia. We translate the functional difficulty into what it would mean for employment. That is the most important start, because if I'm helping somebody to find work, I need to understand what their mental health concern looks like. How would it impact their ability to look for work and stick to work, maintain work? So all of that stuff that we talked about, if I can't concentrate, if I don't sleep well at night, this is what we're looking for. We're not necessarily interested in the label. It could be depression, it could be schizophrenia. We want to know what it looks like. And everyone who is an employment support person can do that. We don't need to be a allied health professional. So that's the first step.
I think it's really important that you do have that conversation, because mental health doesn't impact two people the same way.
That's exactly right. That is the most important question. And most support services today are encouraged to say, what is your experience to a person? So there's a positive shift away from the label itself, because a label, contains all sorts of presumptions and, prejudice and all of that sort of stuff. Whilst what we're looking to understand is, how does it impact the person and how can we improve their function? Because when the function or those areas of challenge are improved, that would improve their employability ultimately, which is part of the day-to-day function.
Now, this might be the most important question that I ask you all day. If we think a friend or a colleague might be struggling, where can they turn to? What are the first steps that they can take towards getting professional help?
I agree with you, Shaun. I think that this is one of the most important conversations that we need to have, particularly because we know that most people, through their lifetime would experience some sort of a mental health concern. We can probably safely say that all people, whether it's, at a diagnosable, sort of level or not, that's not really the issue. The issue is the impact on one's life. So it's really important to be able to offer some support, even if you are not really a mental health practitioner, because we all live and work and interact with other people. So, all of these conversations are really quite important. As I said before, when we know that somebody is suffering a mental health complaint, again, we want to understand how it presents. How does it look like in one's day-to-day life? And another important question is what sort of supports anyone that we might be working with in this space. And it could be a client, and like you said, it could be a colleague, could be a friend, could be a family member. What do we do around their supports? That's a very important piece, by the way. When we assess a client, we want to know what their support system is like. We know that people tend to present mental health services pretty late, when something, quite considerable has happened already. And those that actually present early and get early intervention, they do that because they've got a supportive circle around them. They've got people that observe and think there's something that's not quite right. We need to go and we need to do something. So, keeping a very close eye and understanding what the person's support system is like, because that support system is likely to pick up stuff when there's something wrong. And those are the things, by the way, that we can leverage upon when our client starts employment. They would need that support system. So we want to know that it's there for them, essentially. So those are really the most important factors there. Stuff that we need to take notice of is staying attuned to changes. For people that we know, any unusual behavior, changes in demeanor. We talk about any sort of withdrawal from interaction or changes in the pattern of interactions. If we notice that somebody's mood is different, is changing, for good and bad, so to speak. So any of these changes and fluctuations of emotions and mood, we want to kind of keep a bit of an eye open for those things. Things like absenteeism, which is something we might notice in our colleagues or in our family members or friends that tell us that, they're off work sick, they're not there with our colleagues. We might even notice what we call presenteeism, so being at work, but there's serious changes in their productivity or the quality of their work. So any of those markers, any of those things that you pick up are potentially an indication that something's not quite right emotionally or psychologically for a person. And again, any changes with interaction, maybe it's somebody that interacts quite a lot and now there's a change. They might be withdrawing. They might not look like they're not enjoying stuff that they usually enjoying. That's a very big point. If I used to enjoy a hobby or an aspect of my work or doing something specifically, and I just lost my sense of joy from it and I don't feel like doing it, that is a big sign that something's not quite right. And this is when we want to try and reach out and have a conversation. And again, if we know that the person has already got a condition, maybe there's changes in their treatment, maybe their treatment doesn't work anymore, or if we know that there's an element or possibility of self-medication, maybe the person is self-medication with prescription medication or maybe with alcohol, maybe with other substances, that could be a sign that something is very, very different. Now, this is kind of the stage of noticing and maybe observing. How do we start a conversation? Because it's not always easy. It's, quite tricky to start a conversation about it. And being an ally of mental health is, again, something that we spoke about quite a lot. Offering an opportunity to chat, asking someone if everything's okay, feeling comfortable to challenge them and to point out and say, look, I've noticed you used to do this, now you don't do that anymore. How's it going for you? So doing it in a very curious manner.
I think that's also challenging yourself as well, because I think a lot of the time it could be easier not to say anything at all and sort of go about your day. But I think it's really important that people proactively do speak up and ask people if they are okay.
Yeah, it's very, very important. And the only thing we can do about that is keep advocacy, keep education to individuals, to employees, to employers that we work with. Because sometimes the person who is concerned about somebody else has also got a mental health concern or complaint themselves. And looking at another person could be triggering for them. And that's a really unpleasant feeling that, I would want to avoid. And therefore, I might not reach reach out and talk to somebody about what's going on with them. So I think you're absolutely right. And it's up to every single one of us to sort of combat that desire to sort of maybe bury our head in the sand because of the trickiness, the unpleasantness of getting into that. And it's something that we all have to kind of keep on working, as a society. I think we've got an obligation to keep working at. And as people work in our field, it's really our duty to keep people informed, keep employers informed, making sure that mental health is known to be an integral part of life. This is something that we're all going to experience to an extent, to a level. We're going to know people that experience it. And that's one thing that advocacy and education that, we can all do to increase the awareness.
I'm just thinking now, how have you seen it change in your long career? I mean, if you think back to the beginning when you first got started in this industry, I can't imagine mental health would have been spoken about too broadly within the workplace compared to what it is today.
Oh gosh, absolutely enormous. And I'm glad you're wanting to ask about this, because I think that this is a very, important point. And this is a massive, sort of progress that I think we've done as, societies and as, employment environments. When I started working in this industry, there were very few conversations about it. And the level of information, the level of knowledge, education, even in the education system around it was non-existent. Basically, now we know, if I'm even looking at, young people, people that start secondary or even middle school, their literacy around symptoms, difficulties, emotional difficulties, and what it means, and does it mean a mental health condition, and so forth. The level of literacy is really invested upon from a very, very young age, which is great. So more and more people are actually able to recognize what they're going through and recognize some issues as potentially a mental health concern. So that's been a massive change in a lot of countries' cultures, depending on, again, the education system. The other thing that has been happening is increased awareness from employers. So this is something that, as, when we work in the employment field and, maybe having to do employment brokerage and, connecting people with employers, these are conversations that we know that we have to have. In today's labour market, definitely in a place like Australia, we can't afford to consider that we're only going to employ people that meet and exceed our initial requirements, and we don't want anyone else. We know that we can't afford this luxury, because we need employment participation from all walks of life, from all people, and we also need societal improvements for all people. And employment really does improve life because it gives a sense of meaning. So it's a sort of a win-win situation. And increased awareness is something that we're definitely seeing much more in this space, which is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And I guess, Galit, just to finish off today's episode, if there are any employers out there listening who want to learn more or find out more information, they might be concerned about an employee, can you direct them to any starting points, any websites or resources that could sort of get them started on this journey to become more aware of mental health concerns within their workplace?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's really important for employers, to know that they have an option. There is an option. A lot of employers also have a EAP service, growing number. So that's brilliant. They can, a lot of employers can, turn to their own EAP service pretty much straight away. That's absolutely brilliant. A lot of the government-funded agencies or services, like Black Dog Institute, Lifeline, a couple of other services that are publicly funded. Headspace is a really good one, up to 25 years of age. Quite a few of those public services have got certain sections or a certain interface with employers for people who are going into work. For employers, there are a lot of agencies that actually provide education and training for employers, and that's something that I would strongly, recommend to every employer. Even, general education sessions, to employees. One other thing to do, and employers that have done that swear by the benefits of it, is getting representatives, working on a group of representatives and getting them to go go through mental health first aid training. So just like we always, it's a common thing to have first aid representatives and, have them go through training periodically. We have an equivalent training throughout Australia. It's been going on for many years, for, a good decade and a half of mental health first aid training. And you can have champions in every organization that have undergone mental health first aid training. And that's how we can search for it. That's literally the search that you need to put in Google. And having those champions and people that have undergone that piece of training can be your go-to person every time there's a potential concern with somebody at work. And we know about many organizations that have undertaken that and have mental health first aiders, and they cannot stop talking about the benefits of that. So that's probably the first step that I would take as an employer. I'd want to see that. I'd want to see these champions, these representatives in the workplace.
Well, Galit, thank you so much for coming along today and sharing a bit about your career journey. I'll always learn more about you. Sounds like you've led a very interesting life traveling abroad and sharing all this invaluable information. I'm sure our listeners will be able to take a lot away from listening to our conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Shaun. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Candid Conversation with Shaun. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Galit and learned as much as I did. To find out any further information about anything we discussed, or if you're in need of support, please refer to the links in the show notes.